Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and when's the last time you played WoW Classic? Majority of players moved on from the vanilla Classic experience towards the TBC Classic, with their friends and guildies exploring some of the old new dungeons, old new raids from back in the day, and kind of exploring their characters forward into a new era. It's safe to say that WoW Classic, the vanilla version, is kinda dead, so Blizzard is trying to breathe some new life into it with Season of Mastery, otherwise known by many players as Classic Fresh. It's a way for them to add some extra rules and change some aspects of the game based on the feedback of the original WoW Classic, which is completely in conjunction to the whole no changes crowd, but this is kinda like WoW Classic #changes instead. I decided to hop on the beta, and with how lively and fresh and with how many people are online, I thought I maybe should cover this, but Classic isn't really a staple on this channel. But if you wanted to succeed, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it or found it informative, but also comment about anything when it comes to Classic that we talk about in this video, letting your voice heard, if you think this is a good idea, or what Blizzard should do differently as we talk about some of the different changes. That stuff helps out the channel tremendously. But anyway, let's just jump into what is Classic Season of Mastery Beta, or otherwise known by many players as Classic Fresh. Classic Fresh is going to be a fresh start server. That means it's a clean slate where everybody begins at square one. No one has a gold advantage. No one has a level advantage. Nobody has any advantage. You're starting at level 1 with everybody else. When TBC Classic got announced, a lot of players wanted for Blizzard to do a clean slate server where you weren't competing against players that have all this endgame gear from other raids and all this gold that they've collected playing the game, because essentially you're going to whatever server at a disadvantage where other players already are starting ahead of you, and it felt unfair. So Classic Fresh experience with the new seasonal server would be that opportunity for players to start fresh at the starting line with everybody else to make it fair. But the server will have changes like we talked about earlier. One of them is faster leveling. Now, depending where you are, you either love the original Classic vanilla leveling or you thought it was a bit of a grind. What they wanted to do this time around the server is to increase the amount of experience you gain from quests, to mimic the level speed of Burning Crusade Classic. And a lot of people loved that Blizzard increased the amount of XP for quests. It felt a lot better than having to grind mobs for endless hours, where quests were a little bit more rewarding, especially when they were tougher quests that were a little higher level than you. Third, the content of the server will be just like the original Classic, as in Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, but slightly adjusted, like the BGs are going to be available day 1 instead of like Phase 2. So you won't have that crazy world PvP going on, probably. But instead, this content is going to roll out, instead of several months, over 12 months. So over a year, every 2 months, you'll be able to come back on the game, have yourself a couple of weeks worth of gameplay if you commit a character on a Classic seasonal server, and you'll always have something to do every 2 months, whether it is a Nixia layer opening or something with PvP or Dharmal opening. If you've never played those content back in the day, maybe you leveled then you kind of fell out of it, this will be an opportunity to actually try out some of that endgame content with everybody else. Third, they're making the game a little bit harder. They found that the game is a little bit of a pushover. A lot of players said that the game was really easy, so they're going to try to make it a little bit more challenging based on player feedback. 1, world buffs are removed instead of raids. A lot of people hated the world buff meta, so a lot of people are excited that world buffs will no longer be necessary, but also can't even be used inside of raids. You can still use them in other content like world content, but you can't use them inside of raids anymore. They're even thinking of restoring some of the mechanics that were removed from bosses pretty early in the development, so this time around you're doing Ragnaros, you might have a mechanic extra or two, which should hopefully make things a little fresh. Bosses in raids also going to have extra health, which hopefully will make them less damage spongy, but rather will allow bosses to be able to complete their full rotation of abilities, and maybe even increase the amount of DPS necessary from players inside of that raid in order to be able to defeat these bosses. No boss debuff limit, so if you're a class with a bunch of damage over time abilities, you're probably going to play slightly differently this time around in Classic than you did back then. Because of the limited amount of debuffs that you can have on a boss, your classes mostly came down to just pressing one button for rotation. So classes are actually going to feel a little bit different, even though they're not changing themselves, not yet at least, but they are going to already feel different because of this debuff limiter. And also they're thinking of tackling mages down to the ground, especially those that are doing dungeon boosting. They don't like the dungeon boosting. They heard the community that hated dungeon boosting, where players were out instead of open world and tackling some of the tough quests and looking for groups and just actually playing the game. Instead, they were just AFKing inside of instances while the mage pulled half the dungeon, AoE'd it down, and everybody else got experience. And all you had to do is make sure to pay the mage a little bit of gold every time you leveled. They're even thinking of adding some other quality of life stuff, like making meeting stones into summoning stones, just like they are in TBC, so you can use them to summon your allies as if you have a warlock in your group, as well as maybe adding more nodes for mining and herbalism in order to support a much healthier economy. Now, this isn't the final list of changes, as they are listening to feedback from the community, and there's a lot of suggestions by community. One of them being, what if Blizzard for this classic fresh server decided to change the way our classes play, just a little bit. I'm not really well versed in classes for vanilla, but a lot of the caster classes that weren't mages or warlocks really struggled on mana. Like, they were actually not bad classes as long as it was short fight when they could use their abilities. So there's a question whether they can maybe adjust the mana cost of abilities, or maybe even allow those classes to get some of the passives from TBC that gave them a bit smoother mana regeneration. So maybe meme specs like Retribution Paladins can actually be played inside of raids instead of packing the raid full of warriors and rogues. What if they brought in the original old school Alterac Valley instead of the newer Alterac Valley that was just more like a rush to the boss and kill him before the enemy team kills your boss? Maybe some of the quality of life stuff from TBC, like potentially adding guild banks so guilds can have an easier time managing their items. Botting is also a pretty massive issue in Classic, whether it's TBC or the original vanilla. It really shifted around the prices and servers and pretty much drained a lot of that fun out of the game. And Blizzard wasn't really super aggressive at tackling bots. Even though there were bans, there was a lot of footage of players just seeing bots crowded over in graveyards or farming different nodes or just running into dungeons and clipping through them. If they could be more aggressive on banning bots, I imagine it would make for a much healthier server experience. There are suggestions on how to change the way Black Lotus drops, fix the coding to prevent people from fly hacking and teleporting through the game, save faction battlegrounds for the classic version for Horde vs Horde or Alliance vs Alliance to help mitigate queues, fix terrain so people can clip to certain areas or get into some of the outer reach areas like in Battlegrounds for example. Essentially just make some quality of life changes towards cleaning up the game, cleaning up the bots, and cleaning up how we interact with the game and a lot of the things that people can abuse in order to exploit the game. Changing up the balance tunings of classes so not everybody is a trash can tier but one or two classes in terms of which specs are viable, which ones are not, because everybody's going to play the meta anyway. As much as players don't like the meta, the game is going to be meta gamed either way. So if they can adjust it so off meta specs, something that was a meme spec back in the original, can be a little bit better this time around, then it'll feel less bad if you end up bringing like a Retribution Paladin to a dungeon. Essentially, keep the game as it was, but slightly better based on player feedback. It's very difficult to figure out what is the great middle ground between what players want in terms of changes and which ones they don't, as it seems that everybody is pulling in all directions. Some players want one change but not the other, so how do you please everybody? That is going to be definitely a challenge for them to just finally listen to the players and fine-tune the game to be perfect so the majority of players are happy. But there are some things that they can remove and limit in the game like bots and mage boosting, and that'll make majority of players happy just with that change alone. Either way, that's still going to be a tough task, and I don't envy anybody at Blizzard that's working on this project at all. I think it's actually really cool to add Season of Mastery, but there's always a question of will players actually play it? You are coming up with a seasonal classic World of Warcraft idea that sounds weird on paper. I mean, if someone played back in Classic and they're playing in TBC, why would they want to go and play Classic all over again? It is weird. However, I do kind of like it. Classic vanilla is basically dead. I don't know a lot of people that are playing it right now. There's always forum posts about just how dead it is and how empty the servers are. I mean, Blizzard must have known that with the release of TBC, you're going to have a lot of guilds and players want to play TBC because for some, TBC was a better version of Classic. Classes were better, the content was improved, and it was super nostalgic, and a lot of people got in during TBC, whether it was for the arenas or it was for the dungeons and the questing or the Blood Elves, but a lot of players played in TBC, so of course their friends were going to want to join them in TBC, and then guilds were transferred to TBC, and eventually everybody went to TBC and almost no one was left in vanilla. Vanilla Classic is essentially dead. So for Blizzard to give players a reason to play Vanilla Classic with this new version of the game, with the changes that players always wanted, with slightly faster questing experience so you don't have to do exactly the same grind again, but it still is going to be a bit of a grind since it is still a slower experience than compared to like modern WoW. It might even be enjoyable. You're giving players a reason to play the original game. And if you have enough awesome changes that get players excited to want to come back and check out the seasonal upgrades, whatever the seasonal changes they make every few years or so, I think it'd be kind of cool. Now, the seasonal servers, we don't really know of the seasonal changes, like what is going to be different about the game, what adjustments they're making, or any kind of seasonal buffs they're going to provide, or seasonal game modes, or anything like that. We have no idea what they mean in terms of seasonal, but I imagine it will be like Season 1 is certain type of game, or the game plays in a specific way. Season 2, something new is going to be different, some other passive that changes how we play the game, then Season 3, Season 4. And it is pretty weird to think of like Classic WoW, Vanilla WoW as a seasonal game, but if that gets more players playing the game, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. One of the more depressing things, and during this video I actually wanted to hop on TBC Classic to test out how fast the leveling is, to compare it together with the Season of Mastery beta version of Classic WoW. And the difference is pretty stark, not in the questing is about the same, but just in the world. TBC Classic leveling on one of the most popular Alliance realms is pretty dead. You barely see any players in the first starting zones, which is a little depressing compared to Season of Master Beta, since you know it's new, a lot of players are checking it out. But if this gives Vanilla WoW some life, if this gets more players out in the open world, if this gets players out there interacting and questing together and doing stuff all over again, I think that in its own could be one of the biggest advantages, is how it breathes life and players back into that vanilla experience, back into the original experience, which by itself, I think that could be one of those biggest draws. Either way, that's my whole video on the Classic Season Mastery Beta. I've been playing it a little bit here and there, been trying it out for a bit. It is an interesting concept I want to cover in this channel. You guys let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below, but thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys all in another video.